Welcome to the talk. Thank you for coming out. My name is Greenwood Ericksen. I teach in the Game Design Master of Science program at Full Sail University. And there we go. And in my spare time, I also do some research on Metacritic, which I sort of think is interesting, and obviously some other people do too. So I want to talk a little bit today about some of the work that we have done at our... Can I step down off of this thing, or am I going to break any rules? Can I move? Okay, all right. Wasn't sure what the rules were. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the research we've been doing at Full Sail University. I have a couple of grad students there in my lab, and this is something we occasionally look at. I'm sorry about the small print. I'm an academic, and we're used to like slides full of pages and pages of bullet points here. One of the first things I want to look at, and I think it's an important starting point because people often forget this in the debate that happens over Metacritic or metareview, is why and how we got to a point where metareview mattered in the first place. Why do we have it? Why do we need it? Then a little bit about how metareview works. And then obviously some of the problems, some of the positives and negatives associated with it, things that go wrong, things that go right. And then a little bit about some of the research we've done and some of the research we're planning to do in the future. So in the vein of sort of starting us off at a relevant starting point, I really feel like it's important to remember that really early on, when the game industry just was getting started in the mid to late 70s, there was really only one publication in the entire game industry. That was Playmeter. Playmeter came out in 1974. It's still published today, which makes it, as far as I know, the longest running computer game publication. Playmeter, of course, dealt with all electronic games, which also included pinball machines and electronic poker and a bunch of other stuff that we don't really consider video games today. But it was the first of its kind, and subsequently there were a lot of additional, as time went on, more and more game publications appeared. Weekly Shonen Jump started having a feature on video games on a weekly basis as early as the late 70s, early 80s. EGM, which is still around, right? Computer and video games, Computer Gaming World, and then Nintendo Power, which was where I sort of joined the discussion. That was the first game. I see some nodding. Yeah, that was the first game magazine I ever read. But as you see, as time goes on, this gets more complicated. I just typed in the phrase video game magazine into Google and hit images, and this is what I got, and there were like 10 more pages of that. And probably more than 10 pages. And what you see here is a massive diversification of opinions with regards to games. I mean, when Playmeter was the only publication out, whatever they said was whatever the industry sort of thought about a game, what the public thought about a game. Now there are so many different opinions, so many different viewpoints that it's very, very difficult for a consumer to track and understand all of the different perspectives on this. And this is not just a problem for the game industry, this is a problem in all media. Anytime that you have a diversification of media and a diversification of opinions, especially as expressed over the internet, there's a lot of difficulty in actually identifying all the information that's out there. So this proliferation of opinions and publication led to a really severe case of information overload, in which, when you have several hundred extant sources for video game reviews, which is probably an understatement today, an underestimate today, it's virtually impossible to know what everybody said about everything. And this is really where metareview started to become important. You see the sort of rise of metareview in this context, because it was designed to manage information overload. And the industry has sort of seen, as metareview has grown, you sort of see it early, late 90s with Rotten Tomatoes and then early 2000s with Metacritic. But as time has gone on, it's become increasingly important to the game industry, or at least increasingly visible in the game industry. Yeah, that visual contrast looked better when I was at home on looking at my computer. I'm sorry if it's hard to read now. I thought I was being clever by having a nice shiny backdrop. So the industry has reached a point where clearly many people feel like Metacritic and sites like it are a really important part of the industry, for better or for worse. And it's easy to see why. There are a lot of cases where we've seen where metareview and Metacritic in particular have had a significant impact on the course of the industry. The response to Homefront and the reviews for Homefront causing probably causing, although scientists are always careful about causation, but probably causing a drop in THQ stock price that may or may not have eventually led to severe financial problems over there and eventually bankruptcy. Issues with bonus money for games like Fallout New Vegas and more recently, apparently Destiny may also have had some metareview bonuses in there. It's interesting, actually, Warren Spector a couple of years ago at DICE gave a talk where he talked about the most important things in games, and Metacritic made it onto the list. I think he was being tongue-in-cheek, but it still underlines the level of visibility that this particular issue has in the industry. Now, I'm an academic, which means I don't really have a dog in this fight most of the time. I get to kind of hang out on the sidelines and watch what goes on. But while I was doing this, and while my students and I were doing this, one of the things that we noticed was we started having questions about how this worked and why. And some of these were sort of obvious. First one was like, well, why is this such a big deal? Why does it matter that your Metacritic score is a 79 instead of an 81? You know, why does that matter? And of course, following from that, well, how does this work? Where did they get this score from in the first place? How does it get put together? And does it even work at all? I mean, does this make any sense? Is it coherent? And that sort of led us to some deeper questions, like does this help or hurt the industry? More complicated stuff. And maybe, and who does it help or hurt? And also, ultimately, are there better ways to do this? And it was these interests that sort of led us to start looking into some of this stuff. And we still have an ongoing research project. So now when I say we, I need to clarify who I mean. So these are two of my grad students who sadly couldn't be with us today. They're busy working on their successful Kickstarter game. I don't have a successful Kickstarter game, but they do. So they're shipping that next week. It's called Perry Arian, in case anybody's interested. But this is Erica and Cameron. And they're the ones who did most of the hard labor on this. Professors, we have the advantage of sort of saying, yeah, go study this, and then we just put our name on your stuff after you're done working on it. So an important starting point, I think, when we're talking about meta review in general and Metacritic in particular, since that's the site that sort of draws the most attention, is a discussion of why it's important to have it. Because a lot of people say, well, let's kill it, let's get rid of it. And the fact is, if we didn't have something like Metacritic, we would probably need to invent it. And the reason that I say that is because we're getting back to that information overload problem. There's just too much stuff out there for the average consumer, which, by the way, is not us, right? We get paid to think about video games and come to video game conferences, but the average user has seconds to maybe minutes to make a decision about whether to buy a product or not, and they don't have time to spend 3 hours combing the internet for all the different perspectives on something. So reducing that information overload is a really valuable service to consumers, but it comes with some price, some cost. We'll talk about that later. Ultimately, there's two things that meta review sites and meta review in general are really good at. The first is being a clearinghouse for lots of different opinions, right? Getting lots of opinions together in the same place where you can easily access them. And the second thing that it's maybe good at is taking all those opinions and aggregating them together into one-size-fits-all general opinion of the quality of a product. Now, this, of course, is not good in all ways, but it does have some significant advantages. Now, some of the problems that arise as a result of this, remember the basic premise here is we're giving up detail, we're giving up nuance in exchange for clarity. That's essentially what a meta review system does. It says, okay, we're going to skip some of this detail, remove some complexity, but instead, or in exchange, we're going to give you the ability to make a quick decision based on reasonably good data. Now, there are some other issues, some issues associated with that, but there's also some sub-issues related to issues like, and we actually wrote a whole paper on this, which I'll refer you guys to if you want to get into this, but issues with validity in terms of how the assessment happens. Is the measurement appropriate? How is the measurement being done? So on and so forth. I'll talk about those a little bit in a minute. But also with vulnerability to third-party manipulation. A system like this has obvious weak points in terms of the ability to adjust any sort of quantitatively driven system. Any system with a lot of numbers and an algorithm in it is always vulnerable to manipulation, and Metacritic and meta review in general are no exception to that. And ultimately, sort of the core problem in many cases is that it leads to this oversimplification issue. It just makes things less complex, and that's not always a good thing, especially when we're dealing with nuance and, really importantly, with context. You know, there's probably 30 people in here, and I bet there's probably 35 different opinions on what makes a game good. And so what I like may not at all be the kind of thing that makes somebody else like a game. And so when we reduce everybody's opinion down to one number, it creates a situation where that one-size-fits-all number probably doesn't really fit anybody, not perfectly. What's really interesting, I think, about this, too, is that it turns out there's a lot of ways to look at this, a lot of ways to dig into how do we aggregate scores here, how do we aggregate information like this. And there's a number of different approaches to this, some of which we actually already see implemented in the existing system of meta review. If you look at Gamerankings and Metacritic, which are along with iPhone ratings, are probably the highest visibility implementations of meta review, you see two very different philosophies on how scores should be aggregated. Gamerankings does an unweighted average based on all of the extant publications in the game industry. So everybody that they know about that is still currently active, if they publish a review, that review goes into their system, and that number gets aggregated at the same weight, the same value as every other number. Metacritic, by contrast, comes from a perspective of saying, well, some publications are probably more trustworthy and more helpful than others. And so they instead weight their average such that some publications are more trusted and therefore get more of an advantage in terms of how much they contribute to a final Metacritic score. Now, neither of these approaches is perfect, and they're both sort of vulnerable in various ways. Gamerankings' approach of saying, well, all ideas have equal merit, it sounds nice, but in fact, probably all ideas don't have equal merit. Probably not everybody's opinion is as good as everybody else's. If you're reading an article that's written by somebody in a small town paper this is the first video game they've ever played, and they're reviewing it, it's probably not going to be a great review. It's probably not going to have a lot of detail. It may not even be the right kind of person. Sometimes it's a movie critic who got asked to review a video game, and they don't have any idea if it's a good game or not. In other cases, you may have a website that has a strong financial relationship with a distributor of games or with a publisher, in which case, obviously, there's also concerns about the trustworthiness of that. So Metacritic's approach is not necessarily a terrible idea in that context, but it does come with some drawbacks because now someone's got to decide whose opinion matters more than who else's. And that's where a lot of the angst, I think, in this comes from. So there's some pluses and minuses to both of these, right? Metacritic is more selective, Gameranking is more equalitarian, but on the other hand, that also means that it may limit the quality of some of the reviews and some of the aggregation that goes on. Interestingly, Rotten Tomatoes, which no longer reviews games, has a different take on this as well. What they do is they make a binary decision as to whether a review is positive or negative, and then they rate a game based on the percentage of positive versus the percentage of negative reviews. So if a game is 97% fresh, then 97% of all reviews were generically positive. So it's yet another way to do this. And there are certainly still plenty of other ways that this could be done, but these are the ways we primarily see this done right now. All of these different ways have validity issues. There's a paper, actually on the front page of Ludamos right now, the journal Ludamos is a paper by myself and a couple of students where we got into this in great depth. I'm not doing this to plug my paper. It's because I don't have time to talk about this. This was something like 20,000 words, so I don't have time to summarize that in half an hour. But the highlights essentially are that a lot of the issues you see with meta review in general is you lose that diversity. There's a lot of issues with review reliability as well. In terms of how reliable these scores are, also in terms of how reliably we find scores. Sometimes a score, a review is out there and we never find it, or someone doesn't find it, or they don't see it. Sorry, I'm saying we. I should clarify. I have no connection to Metacritic or anybody else. Just to put that out there. I probably should have led with that, right? Another issue we found had to do with distortions when we normalize to a 100-point scale, because some people will rate with like 4 or 5 stars. Some people rate on an A to F grading scale, which is really complicated because is an F a 50 or is an F a 0? That obviously makes a difference in terms of how things get rated together. And if we have a weighting system, whether and how transparent that system ought to be is a big problem. Metacritic obviously is completely opaque. They make a point of not telling anybody how it works for probably fairly good reasons, frankly. Would you want to be the guy at Metacritic who's got to take all the phone calls from angry journalists who got told that their opinion wasn't as worthwhile as anybody else's? I wouldn't want that, frankly. And there's probably a lot of other reasons, right, too, in terms of you may not want someone to figure out, because again, any algorithm-driven system is gameable. You wouldn't want people figuring out, well, okay, if we write our reviews that are this long and we only review these games, that will up our value, and therefore that's what we should all do. So I think there's some valid reasons why you might want to make it opaque, but it does leave you open to criticism of everything from playing favorites to outright corruption. Not that there's any evidence of this. In fact, we've seen some evidence of the opposite in some cases with regards to Metacritic, but it does raise some significant problems. And ultimately, I think the biggest problem that we see with meta review is the application of meta review data. So a game got a 65 on Gamerankings. What should that mean to us as an industry? I would argue that actually it doesn't mean as much as a lot of other really relevant measures. But it is potentially an assessment of game quality, and so people do tend to take it fairly seriously. I should point out in the vein of this, too, that when we've done a quantitative analysis of the relationship between sales and scores, we tend to find very strong positive correlations, such that as game rankings improve, or game ratings improve, the sales of those games improve as well, and that's a Pearson's R there, Pearson's product moment correlation coefficient. And anybody who knows anything about stats knows a 0.72 is a very strong correlation with the PMCC. Not all studies have found values that high. We did another one more recently that was more in the 3 to 4 range, 0.3 to 0.4 range, but that's still significant as a statistical measure. And actually, this is a chart of that data. What you're looking at here is the blue dots are PlayStation games, red dots are Xbox 360 games, but you'll see that the pattern of distribution here is really obvious. It's obviously a positive correlation, but it's also obviously not linear, right? Games do better as higher scores for a certain period in an arithmetic pattern, and then sort of rapidly shoot up at an elbow between 75 and 85 or so. And then you get this sort of asymptotic curve effect up at that upper edge of the range here. And this is sort of interesting because it does just sort of eyeball-wise, it does suggest there's a strong relationship here that's not just driven by one or two games, but is in fact consistent across the whole spectrum. One of the big issues that Metacritic in particular has had, not all meta review sites will have this problem, but they've had in particular, is this notion of secret weights. And secret may be the wrong word. Maybe unannounced would be better. But these are situations where there is a weighting system, but the company that does it doesn't tell anybody about it or won't clarify it or explain how it's driven. When you're trying to understand this, one of the things that we found is there's sort of two ways of looking at this. You can look at what we call derived weights. Derived weights are sort of trying to figure out, because this is a man-made system, trying to figure out what the actual values that Metacritic or somebody else uses are, which turns out is really tough. I'll talk about that in a minute. Or interestingly also, this notion of observed weights. And Scott Swisher up at University of Madison, Wisconsin, has done some really interesting work at this. Actually, he's at Cambridge now, so I don't know if that's moving up in the world or not. But he's done some really neat work. I'll talk about that for a second. Actually, he did a doctoral thesis on review rating and reliability for an economics doctorate. And he found some really interesting patterns across time. I've included the incredibly streamlined and handy link here at the bottom. I'm sorry, there was no other. I tried desperately to find a link that was not 4 lines long, but I just couldn't find one for this. But anybody who's interested in this topic should definitely check out Scott's work. He's done some really interesting stuff. He's found some neat patterns. For instance, what he's really looking for here is how much an individual publication scores push or pull an overall Metacritic score based on what number they gave a game, right? So a highly rated publication will move that needle a lot, whereas a lower rated one will move it much less. And he found some neat effects. For instance, the sort of Jeff Gerstmann scandal at GameStop in 2007, he saw the observed weight of GameSpot take a nosedive right as that was happening, that clearly there was an adjustment in how much GameSpot scores pulled the overall metascore around after that event occurred, which suggests that there's some sort of logical system that's driving these weightings. It's not arbitrary. It's driven at least to some degree by credibility. It was really interesting. He has a ton of other conclusions. It's something like 185 pages long. So, drink a cup of coffee before you start reading it. But it's some great stuff in there. One of the things that we've done, though, in our lab, which is a little different from what Scott is looking at, is this notion of derived weights, of figuring out what the weights are, or trying to figure out what the weights are, even though we're not being told what they are. And this is actually a really tricky prospect for a lot of reasons. One is that Metacritic and many other meta review sites will round their scores. They don't give you a score of 56.261432, which makes sense, right? Because nobody wants to see that many decimal points. But it does also have a drawback when you're trying to understand where it comes from, because that creates almost a full point of potential variance in terms of what that actual derived score could be, and still meet the requirement to come in with that whole number. So that makes it much more difficult to solve for that sort of equation. Another thing that's a problem is that we know that review sites will adjust their weightings over time, which makes sense, right? I mean, not all publications will stay the same all the time. New publications emerge, old publications disappear. That's something you've got to take into account. We also had a number of problems that you get anytime that you try to do a model of anything. One of those is identifying the starting weights that you work with. Figuring out where your starting point is has a lot to do with where you wind up. So you've got to come up with reasonably coherent starting points. And that's often difficult to do, especially if you have very little data on how a system works. And in this case, we have an additional complication, was that unlike in the real world where we assume that, or we're modeling sort of natural processes, where we don't assume that there are artificial levels to things, in this context, we made an assumption early on that Metacritic in particular was probably using a tiered weighting system, where publications fell into different tiers of credibility as far as Metacritic assessed it, and therefore different tiers of weight. I'll talk about that assumption in a minute, because some of the assumptions, it turned out, were not great. So we did a first pass at this. We had done some initial computational analysis, and we presented this at GDC with, I think, some mixed reviews. One of the things, there was a number of things that we didn't do very well when we presented this data, and one of the things was we didn't do a good job of explaining what a model is. So I'm going to take just about a minute here and tell you guys a little disclaimer and talk about what a model is. So a model is always wrong. I want to lead with that. We're always wrong. The sort of father of modeling once famously said that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. So when we're talking about modeling a process, what we're saying is we're trying to figure out an answer that is helpful and useful and potentially close, but we don't expect it to be perfect. So just bear that in mind as I talk about all this. Like if I say, hey, we found this great solution, what I'm saying is we found a solution that looks like it works. That doesn't mean it's absolutely guaranteed to be the truth or to be accurate, especially in a case where there is actually somewhere a verifiable truth that we don't have access to. So we presented this to GDC. We got some great feedback out of this, some from people that we met there, but also, surprisingly, Metacritic actually weighed in on this directly. They actually responded to us and published a little piece of fan mail that I'll show you in a minute. But the best part about this was that Metacritic published a ton of new information about how they do their weightings and how their system works that had never been previously available. And that changed a whole bunch of our assumptions, gave us a whole bunch of new data to work with, but also expanded the knowledge base about what was going on out there. We actually found, as part of this modeling process, we discovered also that our approach, while fundamentally sound, had some significant issues in terms of how we applied it and where we applied it. Things about issues with reliability and human error, issues with model stability, and really importantly also issues with uniqueness. One of the things that we found when we got new data and went back and looked at it was that there were actually several possible solutions that we had not found that were just as stable as our original solution. So that was a bit of an oopsie, but we learned a ton from this experience, which is kind of what the point was in the first place. This is Metacritic's response. It boils down, if you take away all the pithy writing and sarcasm, it basically boils down to we had too many tiers in our original model. Our range of weights, that is, say, the range from the lowest to the highest tiered publications was too large, and at least some of those weights were wrong. Maybe all. You know, they weren't specific enough on this to be sure. One additional point that I actually forgot to point out here also was that they changed much more rapidly. They changed weights much more rapidly than we had originally thought they had. Our original data set included 10 years of data, and we just sort of naively assumed that they would stay more or less the same for 10 years. And obviously that was not a great assumption. So we've actually come back. My student Cameron, who you met earlier in digital form, will be presenting our next model at GDC in 2015, or our refined model. Again, it's a model, so it's wrong. I promise it's wrong. Hopefully it's not totally wrong. But it's a much more computationally robust model. We automated a lot of the processes that were human-driven last time, because that had gotten us into trouble in terms of making sort of small arithmetic mistakes. When you do 1,000 iterative processes, humans are not really good at that, and once in a while you'll screw up. So we removed a lot of sources of human error. We incorporated all that really valuable new data that Metacritic had provided for us. We also narrowed it down to a very narrow time frame, 3 months, and down to a single platform, because we aren't really sure if, for instance, weights stay the same across different for the same publication across different platforms. So publication X may get a weighting of a certain thing when a certain level when it reviews an iOS game, but might be a different level when it reviews an Xbox 360 game. We don't know. It could be the same, could be different. There's really no way to be sure. Based on this, we were able to identify a stable model with 0% error, although we did that last time too, right? So again, take this with a grain of salt. That shouldn't be shocking, though, because 0% error is entirely possible when you're dealing with a man-made system. It can definitely happen. But again, that doesn't mean that it's exactly right. So we want to be real careful to be clear about this. Cameron will be presenting that at GDC in San Francisco in March. So if anybody's interested, I encourage you to come out and see the full presentation on that, as opposed to the sort of real quick overview I'm giving you here now on that. While we were doing this work, we actually had another core question that sprang to mind, and that was, well, does this matter at all? You know, does weighting make a difference in the first place? And so what we did essentially was to compare the data for the last full year of data that we had at the time we were doing this. This is the end of 2013, so we used all of 2012 data on this, and we essentially looked at 3 different measurements of game quality: Metacritic score, game ranking score, and then a score that we developed, which was basically just Metacritic's, the publication that Metacritic curates without any of the weighting. So we just threw all of those publications, we basically treated it like it was game rankings data, but we used Metacritic's curated scores. And we found in each case there was a significant correlation between sales and scores, so that supported previous findings that there was clearly a relationship between metascore of any kind and sales. But we found something really interesting, which was that when you look at these, the three different bars here are those three different measures. There's virtually no difference among them. Not the three groups of bars, rather, but each bar in each of these three groups. So what you're seeing here on in this left column is the first week sales. The middle column is all the sales for the year of 2012. And then the final column was all the sales at the time that we had done this data collection, which was like the end of 2013 or so. If you notice, the unweighted Metacritic score, the Metacritic score, and the game ranking score are almost identical for all of these. There's really no significant difference among them, which surprised us, right? And you would have thought that with all the pain and angst that goes into these discussions about weighting and Metacritic, that it would have made a big difference, but it didn't. In fact, this is a non-significant result, but if you look, there's a very, very tiny edge for actually the highest in each case being Metacritic's unweighted score was actually more predictive of sales by a tiny, tiny, tiny non-significant margin than the others. As a scientist, I have to be clear, that's meaningless. That difference is very, very tiny. It's irrelevant. But it is still kind of interesting to look at those charts. And I think the core point here is it's not any better. That's not to say that it's bad or making it worse. It just isn't really adding to the predictive value of this score system. Which means, interestingly, that from the perspective of sales prediction or sales modeling, the weights don't actually matter. And that maybe shouldn't have surprised us because it turns out that whether it's a highly trusted publication or a not highly trusted publication, the differences in those scores tend to be quite small. So journalists from highly ranked publications, journalists from low ranked publications do seem to kind of have the same viewpoints. They see a game the same way. That might have some interesting implications, though. For instance, it could suggest that reviewers have very similar opinions, which would be a good, positive interpretation, right? Reviewers are all the same, they're all really good. Or it could mean that reviewers are norming their scores to previously published reviews. It could be that if I work for publication X and I'm about to go to press and I want to give a game a 60, and I take a look at Metacritic and I find that the average is a 74, I may go, ooh, maybe it was actually a 70 instead of a 60. Now, there's no way to be sure about that. Well, actually, there is a way to be sure about it. Let's talk about that in a minute and some of the stuff we're going to do next. But that's a really interesting implication, too, because it would fit very much with human nature. People do tend to not want to stick out from the herd because people who stick out from the herd get eaten by tigers. So it makes a lot of sense that that people might do that, but it raises some interesting questions about how we should look at this. Ultimately, one of the things that I think is so interesting, it suggests that if Metacritic wanted to, they could probably drop this and not have the slightest effect on the predictive value of their score. Metacritic obviously has very able leadership that has a vision for their company, so I would never dream of telling them what to do. But I think they could duck a lot of criticism if they did that. All right, so ultimately, this is where we are at this point in our research. We've done some work on this, and one of the things that we've found a couple of things that we think are sort of interesting and valuable. Some interesting questions we've looked at in terms of whether game reviews adjust their scores based on already published reviews, whether scores and averages tend to go up or down over time. These are things that we really don't know. We don't really know if over time scores tend to tail up or to tail down as they come in over time, right? So, like, are the first scores out the gate higher or lower than later scores? We're not really sure. And does marketing affect scores and sales? Does putting more money into marketing have a significant effect on the outcome of that in terms of a Metacritic score? One would think not, right? Journalists shouldn't be influenced by marketing. But it may very well be the case that they are. We don't really know. Journalists are humans, like everybody else, and we're all vulnerable to marketing, or no one would do marketing, right? If it didn't work, we wouldn't do it. So that's an interesting question. And finally, of course, the big one that we're looking at is whether, in fact, you're going to see a compression of variance over time, which would indicate that reviewers are norming their scores to previously published reviews, which would also be kind of an interesting finding. And again, would be very consistent with human nature. We'd kind of expect that people might tend to do that. And if they do, that would have interesting implications in terms of how people, for instance, try to manipulate Metacritic or other types of meta-review publications. Ultimately, I think the takeaway, if there is one from this presentation, is that there's more work that needs to be done here. We've found out some things, and we're going to keep looking at this in the huge amount of spare time that we have. But there's a lot more questions that could be asked here than we're going to be capable of answering. So it would be great if other people started looking at this. Also, I wouldn't be the only person kind of hanging out here getting yelled at either. So that would be nice too. But this has implications not just for the game industry, but for virtually all media. Anybody who deals with media now is dealing to some degree with meta-review. And that suggests that this is going to be a problem for everybody, for film, for literature, for games. These are questions that are relevant. We need things like this, probably, as consumers, which means that we need to figure out how to do it in a way that's better or at least less controversial. And that's something that I think I'd really like to leave you guys with is we need to think about a way to do this that doesn't make us all, drive us all to each other's throats all the time. There's probably a way to do it, but I'm not sure what it is, and I think we probably need to start thinking about that. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to entertain, I swear I hit that button, entertain comments, questions or comments at this time.
I have to ask the first question.
Okay.
So I apologize in advance. So you're saying actually it's about ethics in game journalism?
Oh God, no. No.
Sorry.
No comment. I want nothing to do with that. It's not about ethics, it's about numbers. That's my answer. Yeah.
What do you think about publishers which deal with developers and they include sometimes in some contracts the Metacritic scores? Mm-hmm. What do you think about this? What is your opinion?
I'm not an ethicist, and I don't know very much about journalism. We were talking earlier, and I was saying I'm interested in the numbers. This is sort of an intellectual exercise for me. I don't have a dog in this fight. Certainly, that might have an impact on scores. You know, having a bias on the, and we all have biases in various ways, right? Some people are biased towards liking certain kinds of games. Some people are biased towards, with sort of publisher loyalty. Other people are biased towards wanting to reward their friends. All of those are potential sources of variance, we call uncontrolled variance, which is our term for stuff that goes wrong, right, in any sort of numeric system. So could that have an impact? Absolutely, if it's going on. But it's very difficult to know if it's going on, right? I mean, it comes down to someone saying, yeah, I do it, or no, I don't. And there's obviously a strong social pressure not to say that you're responding in ways that may or may not be consistent. Did I get at your question, or did I sort of miss the point?
No, I was more just wanted to, because sometimes, for example, there are some publishers that say that the minimum Metacritic scores mm-hmm. should be reached.
Yeah.
And this is included in the contract, but as you presented the Metacritics, there are a lot of weaknesses. Mm-hmm. So I was just wondering if you think it's justified, or if not, or.
I can't comment on the business practice. I'm not a manager, and I don't know that side of it. But I would say that looking only at metascore is not, and that's true across any sort of meta review, is probably not a great strategy. It probably makes a lot more sense to look at sales to some degree, right? If you're looking at financial value for a company. But I think part of the impetus here that publishers work with is they want to disentangle the efforts of effective marketing from the effect of the game quality, right? So if it's a great game, you really don't need to market it at all, right? Maybe, although I would argue you probably still should.
But it's not true.
Well, which now?
I mean, just for example, the Call of Duty, even mm-hmm. if it's a good game, this is the most important budget, marketing budget, I mean, and far away from the development budget. Mm-hmm. So.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I'm following.
No, it's okay. But I mean, this is not only the quality of the game.
Right.
This is the budget that is put also in the marketing side.
Right. Well, and I think the reason publishers do pay attention to this, I'm not a publisher, but I would think one of the reasons they pay attention to Metacritic or Gamerankings values is that it at least purports to some degree, or looks to be, a measurement of game quality as opposed to the quality of game marketing. And so it helps them to say, well, we want to give you a bonus, or to maybe deprive you of a bonus, because we think that your contribution as a developer to the product was this much, and marketing's contribution was this much, and so we want to apportion out the rewards of success differently, which I think is to some degree a valid impulse, but I'm not sure, as you see from this case, I mean, the correlation is very strong, but correlation is not, as the internet loves to remind us, causation, right? So it could be that Metacritic sales and scores tend to be strongly correlated because Metacritic scores are highly correlated with good reviews, which are correlated with a game being good, which should also cause it to sell, right? So in fact, if there wasn't a correlation there, we'd be deeply, deeply worried, right? Because that would suggest there's something really wrong with the system. So I mean, I think I sort of get what you're getting at, like, you know, these sort of developer targets and the bonuses associated with that. I know it's a highly questionable, it's a practice a lot of people question. I can't really comment on the ethics of it. I do think the impulse makes sense in terms of rewarding high-performing games. And I think that metareview is a pretty good, well, I'm going to be real careful when I say this. I don't know of a better way to quantify game quality unless you wanted to have independent people rate them, right? But that's kind of what's going on with reviews anyway, right? So there are probably worse ways to do it, I guess is what I'm saying. But I'm sure that it's extremely frustrating at a personal level, especially if you're Fergus Urquhart, and I don't know how to pronounce his last name, and you missed Fallout New Vegas' bonus by 1 point. I mean, that's got to just eat at you, right? So did I answer your question that time? Okay, I got there after a while.
I have a real question now.
Okay.
Do you see any interesting correspondence between something like Metacritic and sort of the wisdom of crowds, you know, like averaging out, because that is supposed to be a fairly good way of, you know, finding a certain result, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some value to this concept, right? If you get a whole bunch of opinions, and we know in statistics we always want a large sample, right? You always want a large sample because any one individual outcome could be anything. Like, so two football teams play each other, right? Yeah. So when two football teams play each other, and one team is a lot better than the other, what happens in one game? Anything. Right? We have no idea how that outcome. But over the course of, say, 100 games, we can be pretty sure the better team is going to win more often. So yeah, I mean, that wisdom of crowds notion does tend to hold up. Having 100 scores and aggregating those is probably a better overall assessment of what the universal crowd, if you will, thinks about something. But it also discounts a lot of individual variance, right? People don't, I mean, well, that's a bad example. I was going to use a baseball example, but nobody will get it. The sort of broader issue here is, I think, is that you and I have very different viewpoints potentially on games, and so your 60 could be my 90, and giving us both the same score doesn't, for the same game, doesn't make a lot of sense given our individual differences and preferences. And so that's, I think, one of the major drawbacks. I talked about that briefly earlier, but yes. So I think it's got value, but it's got limitations as well.
Okay.
Thank you, and thank you for coming out here and
Sure.
Engaging us in this kind of philosophical discussion, in a sense. I have a question, or possibly a comment, or maybe suggestion for further research. Have you ever given any thought into a kind of a relationship between the time when the reviews start to come in and the release date, and whether that has any impact? I know that some publishers are obviously putting embargoes on reviews and only allowing reviews to come in on the release date.
Sure. Well, and that's one of the obvious ways to manipulate a score, is to make sure that only people who like the game get it early, which is one of the, you know, I ducked your question earlier, which was clearly about Gamergate, yes. But there is a potential statistical problem when for instance, publishers can, or not just a statistical problem, but sort of a practical issue. If a group, say in this case publishers, controls the distribution of a product and can put it into the hands of certain people before others, then the early reviews that will come in will tend to be those people who got really early copies, right? And so if you carefully pick who gets those early copies, that's going to have a significant impact probably on what that initial score out of the gate is. And if, as we said earlier, if other journalists are then norming their scores to those early scores, that can have an effect not just early, but throughout the life cycle of that product. So, I mean, absolutely, you know, there could be effects here that are related to that phenomenon, and things like review embargoes, things like you know, sort of, or some of the agreements. I know some of this have been story breaking about Shadow of Mordor and the way in which Warner Brothers dealt with that. You know, again, I try not to make judgments. I'm into the stats, not the ethics, but certainly that type of behavior could have had a significant impact on those early scores. And if you affect the early scores, it seems probable that trickle-on effect may very well. We haven't looked at that data yet, right? But if what we expect to see is in fact what we see, which is to say that variance shrinks and scores tend to stick towards where the original starting point was, then it would make a lot of sense that would have an impact. But again, we don't know that. That's a hypothesis we're currently investigating. So
there's a discussion going on right now about whether we should move away from sort of consumer-oriented, this is how much value you get for your money, game review scores, towards more, this is, you know, like, this is our cultural opinion of games as a cultural artifact. I don't know if you've ever seen German game ratings. They're very detailed, and it's very much like some of them at least. And I was wondering, like, if the industry were to move towards more like, well, you know, more seeing games as a cultural artifact, then we would become closer to movies and probably books to some degree. And so I was then, you know, so I was wondering, like, how do Metacritic like systems work in other media? Like you gave the example with Rotten Tomatoes. It'd be interesting I'm wondering whether that would be better or worse in some way than our current Metacritic system.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a right way to do it. You know, people ask me that a lot when I talk about this. I say, well, is Metacritic doing it wrong? I say, well, I don't think it's wrong. You know, like Miyamoto Musashi, the samurai philosopher, famously said, you should know the harm and benefit in everything, right? These approaches have advantages. They also have disadvantages. So Rotten Tomatoes' approach, sure, I mean, it has a certain clarity to it, but of course it relies, for instance, on the subjective judgment on the part of the person reading the review to determine whether it's positive or negative. I could write a review about a game I really liked that made it sound terrible, or vice versa. And especially if you're not reading it really carefully, or it's not written very well. So that's one issue there. One thing that I would like to see, I would love to see is, and it may be that it's just a technological or workload bandwidth issue, but you know, pulling specific representative comments out of a review and posting those, for instance, next to the number that each publication gives it, which Metacritic sort of does. It uses a little blurb, but the blurb often is not sort of clearly selected. It seems like it's sort of the top thing that pops up at the top of the screen. But that might be really helpful too, you know, having somebody say, wow, this game is just like, it's just like playing Grand Theft Auto with orcs in Mordor, right? I mean, that would have been a great synopsis. I sort of joked with somebody about this, like what that pitch sounded like at WB when they pitched Shadow of Mordor. And it was like, well, it's going to be GTA, but in Mordor with orcs. And like, you know, so like, you can picture what that would have looked like, right? So, I mean, having something like that for each review would be interesting too. It might something that might be helpful to people, I think. But sure, I mean, again, this comes back to this question of, do you want detail or do you want clarity? Because the two tend to be mutually exclusive in any sort of human decision-making process. If you have all the facts, you also are drowning in data. And anybody who deals with analytics knows this problem really, really well. It's like, I have all this data, I have no idea what it means. You know? There's only so much you can do with Fourier transforms. You can smooth out the bumps, but you still got to figure out what that means at the end of the day. Did I answer your question? Or your question, sorry.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you, yes. Anyone else? Any questions?
Anyone? Bueller?
No?
No?
All right.
All right, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thanks for bearing with me. I know it's hot in here, and I talk a lot, so thanks very much, guys.